I found my late father's watch in a box I almost threw away, and the man at the repair shop handed it back to me with shaking hands and said, "Sir, you need to leave. Right now. And don't tell anyone you brought this here." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was being dramatic. I almost laughed. I wasn't laughing an hour later. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I retired 3 years ago thinking the biggest drama left in my life would be deciding whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in the garden. My wife keeps threatening to expand. I am not a detective. I am not a brave man by any particular measure. I am a grandfather of 4 who drinks too much coffee and goes to bed before 10 o'clock most nights. But my father was a complicated man. And the watch he left behind when he died last spring turned out to be something I was never supposed to find. My father's name was Raymond. He passed in April quietly. In his sleep. At 81 years old. In the same house he'd lived in for 40 years in Clarksville, Tennessee. He had been a civil engineer for most of his career, working for a private firm called Hargrove and Associates for over 2 decades before he retired. He was not a rich man. He was not a famous man. He was a stubborn, proud, and occasionally infuriating man who loved baseball, hated small talk, and never once told me he loved me without my mother prompting him first. I loved him anyway. I still do. After the funeral, my wife and I drove up to Clarksville to help my younger sister sort through his belongings. My mother had passed 6 years earlier, so the house was his alone by then, quiet in the way that only empty old houses can be. Full of furniture that hadn't moved in decades, an air that smelled like old paper and something I could never quite name. Familiar and foreign at the same time. My sister wanted to go through things methodically. She had spreadsheets. She had color-coded sticker dots for keep, donate, and discard. I loved her for it because I didn't have the heart to be methodical about anything in that house. I just walked around touching things. His reading chair, the mug he kept on his desk, the framed photo of him and my mother at Niagara Falls in 1987 that sat on the mantel for as long as I could remember, in the back bedroom that he'd used as an office. There were 3 large cardboard boxes pushed under the desk. My sister said she hadn't opened them yet and didn't know what was in them. I pulled them out, thinking they'd be old tax returns or filing cabinets worth of paper that we'd have to shred. The first 2 were exactly that. The third one was heavier than I expected. Under a layer of old manila folders and a couple of outdated engineering manuals, there was a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, dark walnut, with a simple brass latch, no lock. I opened it, and inside, nested in a piece of old green felt, was a watch. A man's dress watch, silver case, white dial, Roman numerals, old, but carefully kept. The crystal was clean. The metal was polished. I had never seen this watch in my life. My father wore the same Timex for as long as I could remember. Brown leather band. Simple face. The kind of watch you bought because it told time, and not because it made a statement. This watch in the box was nothing like that. This was a different kind of watch entirely. The kind a man received as a gift, or as a payment, or as a reminder of something. I turned it over. On the back, engraved in small, careful letters, for R, with gratitude, D, H. I asked my sister if she knew anything about it. She'd never seen it either. I put it in my jacket pocket and didn't say anything else about it. I told myself I just wanted to get it repaired. The second hand had stopped moving and then keep it as something of his a keepsake. Something to sit on my nightstand and remind me of a man I sometimes felt like I never fully knew. There's a watch repair shop in Knoxville that my wife had used once when her grandmother's brooch needed work. A small place on a side street downtown. The kind with a glass display case full of pocket watches and a handwritten sign in the window that said, "All work done on premises." The owner's name was Mr. Beaumont 70s. Slight build, white hair trimmed neat, The kind of man who looked like he had been repairing watches since before you were born and intended to keep doing it after you were gone. I brought the watch in on a Tuesday morning. I set it on the glass counter and explained that the second hand had stopped and I just wanted it running again. Sentimental value. My father's... Mr. Beaumont picked it up without a word. He turned it over the way I had. He read the engraving on the back, and something changed in his face. It was subtle the way color leaves a person's face, not all at once, but gradually, like water draining from a sink. He set the watch down on the felt pad in front of him and looked up at me. Where did you say you got this? I explained again. My father's house. A wooden box under his desk. He passed away 2 months ago. Mr. Beaumont was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the watch again, then at me. Then he came around the counter, went to the front door of the shop, and turned the sign from open to closed. He locked the door. Then he turned back to me and said, in a very calm, very steady voice, Sir, I need you to take this watch and put it back wherever you found it. And I need you to tell no one that you brought it here. I stared at him. I'm not trying to frighten you, he said, and he looked very much like a man who was frightened himself. But I know who gave your father that watch, and if you're his son and you don't know what this is, then for your own good, you should put it back. I asked him who. I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say another word. He unlocked the door. He handed me the watch and waited. I walked out. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could make myself start it. I am a history teacher. For 31 years, I taught young people that the worst thing you can do with a mystery is ignore it. I told them that silence is often the most revealing thing a source can offer. I told them that when powerful people go to lengths to keep things quiet, that quiet is worth listening to. I drove home. I did not put the watch back in the wooden box. That night, after my wife went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the watch and my laptop and began doing the one thing I actually knew how to do. I started researching. The engraving said D.H. My father had worked for Hargrove & Associates for 23 years. The founder's name was Douglas Hargrove. Douglas Hargrove was not a small name in Tennessee. He had built Hargrove & Associates from a two-man operation in the 1970s into one of the largest private civil engineering and land development consultancies in the state. He had his name on buildings. He had his name on a scholarship fund at the University of Tennessee. He had a profile in a regional business magazine from 2009 that called him the architect of modern Middle Tennessee infrastructure. He was 77 years old now, semi-retired, and still listed as chairman emeritus of a company that was now called Hargrove Dalton Partners. My father had worked for this man. My father had received a watch from this man. A watch he kept hidden in a wooden box under his desk, in a room that nobody went into, for what looked like a very long time. I went back through what little I could find about my father's career. I found his name in a couple of old archived articles about public infrastructure projects in the 1990s and early 2000s. Routine stuff, bridge assessments, drainage system evaluations, county road projects. Nothing unusual. And then I found something that was not routine at all. A lawsuit, filed in 2003. A group of homeowners in a subdivision outside of Clarksville, a neighborhood called Millbrook Crossing, had sued the development company that built their neighborhood, alleging that the construction had been approved on land with known soil contamination, and that the contamination had been concealed during the permitting process. The lawsuit named several parties. One of them was Hargrove & Associates, which had performed the soil assessments for the development. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 2005. The terms were confidential. My father's name was not in the lawsuit, but Hargrove & Associates was, and my father had been a senior engineer at Hargrove & Associates throughout that entire period. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I drove back to Clarksville. My sister was still there, finishing up the house, and she let me in without asking too many questions. I went back to the office. I went back to those boxes. I had not looked carefully enough the first time. Underneath where the wooden box had been, at the very bottom of the cardboard box, There was a large manila envelope that I had mistaken for just another folder. It was sealed shut with packing tape that had yellowed with age. My father's handwriting on the front, small, precisi. The way engineers write, said only, "Do not open unless something happens to me." My hands were shaking. I sat down on the floor of my father's office and I opened that envelope. Inside were 43 pages. Some were photocopies of internal memos. Some were handwritten notes in my father's hand. Some were what appeared to be original survey documents and soil assessment reports with sections highlighted in yellow, and notes written in the margins. And stapled to the back of the first page was a small photograph. The old film kind, slightly faded. It showed two men standing beside a truck on what looked like an empty lot. One of the men was my father. He looked younger, probably mid-50s. The other man I didn't recognize. The documents took me 2 hours to read through carefully. What they described was this: in 2001 and 2002. Hargrove and Associates had been hired to conduct soil assessments for a residential development project in a rural area outside Clarksville. My father had been assigned to lead the assessment team. What his team found was that the site had a history of illegal industrial dumping solvents, heavy metals, substances that did not belong in soil where people's children were going to play and where families were going to drink well water. The contamination levels were, in my father's words, written in the margin of one report, far beyond acceptable residential threshold. This site should not be developed. That report, the accurate one, was never filed. Instead, a different version was filed. A version that showed the site as clean. My father had written, in a note to himself, dated March 15, H. Told me the report needed to reflect what the client needed to hear. I told him I could not sign my name to that. He reminded me that I had 2 kids in college. There was a second note. Dated 2 weeks later, I signed the amended report. God help me. I have kept the original here. The original was in the envelope. Both versions, side by side. I sat on that floor for a long time. My father had known. He had participated under pressure, under fear in certifying land that should never have been certified. And then he had spent the next 20 years living with it. He had kept the evidence. He had not destroyed it. He had written those words, "Do not open unless something happens to me," which meant some part of him always intended for this to be found. But he had also accepted the watch, the gratitude. He had kept quiet. For 20 years. The families in Millbrook Crossing had been living on that land. I thought about the lawsuit from 2003. The families who had figured out something was wrong. The settlement that went quiet. The terms that stayed sealed. I thought about my father's hands, shaking slightly in his last years. Something the doctors attributed to age. I thought about the neighbors in Millbrook Crossing and what might have been in their water. I called my sister into the room and showed her everything. She sat down on the floor next to me and read through it without saying a single word for 45 minutes. When she finally looked up, she said, "What are we going to do?" I didn't know yet, but I knew I had to do something. Here is where I need to be honest with you about something. There was a part of me, a real part, not a small part that wanted to put everything back in the envelope. Tape it shut. Slide it back in that box. And drive home and never think about it again. My father was dead. The lawsuit had already happened. The settlement had already been paid. Whatever damage had been done decades ago. But that voice in my head sounds a lot like cowardice when I say it out loud. Because those families were still there. I'd looked up Millbrook Crossing. It was still a neighborhood. People were still living there. And the sealed settlement meant they may never have been told the full truth of what was under their homes. I am a history teacher. I know what it means when the truth gets buried. And I know what it costs. The people whose lives are built on top of it. I spent 2 weeks being careful. I did not call a local lawyer too close to Clarksville. Too many people who might know Hargrove. Instead, I contacted a law professor I'd stayed in touch with from my own college years. A man who now taught environmental law at Vanderbilt. I met him for coffee and I laid out what I had, without showing him the documents first. I wanted to see his face when I described it before I committed to showing him anything. His face told me everything I needed to know. He referred me to an attorney in Nashville who specialized in environmental litigation. Her name was Ms. Pryor. She was in her 40s. Direct. And the kind of person who took notes by hand in a leather-bound notebook and did not make promises she wasn't going to keep. I sat across from her in her office and set the manila envelope on her desk. She read for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "How long have you had this?" 3 weeks. I told her, "You haven't shown this to anyone else, only my sister." And the law professor, she nodded slowly. "Your father kept the original assessment and a paper trail that directly contradicts the filed report." "Do you understand what this is?" I said. "I thought I did. This is evidence that the amended report was knowingly falsified. Combined with the 2003 lawsuit and the sealed settlement, this potentially reopens questions about whether that settlement was obtained under material misrepresentation." She paused. "There are also potential regulatory implications. If the contamination was never properly remediated, if it was simply concealed and built over, there may be current exposure risk." Current. That word landed heavily. "Those families," I said, "we would need testing." She said, "Current soil and water testing. That's a significant undertaking. But yes, if this documentation is what it appears to be, those families may have a right to know." Douglas Hargrove was still alive, still listed as Chairman Emeritus, still had his name on that scholarship at UT. I thought about the watch on my nightstand, about for R, with gratitude, and I felt a cold, steady anger that I recognized as the kind that doesn't go away quickly. "Ems." Pryor moved carefully, in the way you have to when you're going up against a name that has been writing checks in this state for 50 years. She brought in an environmental consultant to conduct independent testing in Millbrook Crossing. That required cooperation from some of the homeowners, people who, when they heard what we were looking into, didn't need much convincing. Several of them had been waiting for 20 years for someone to come back and tell them they hadn't been crazy to worry. The testing confirmed what my father's original report had documented. The contamination was still present, in lower levels than before, some natural attenuation over the decades, but still present. Still above safe thresholds in certain areas. Still, something that should have been disclosed and remediated before the first foundation was ever poured. 3 months after I found that envelope on the floor of my father's office, Ms. Pryor filed a motion to unseal the 2003 settlement based on newly discovered evidence of fraud on the court. She also filed a regulatory complaint with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. The story was picked up by a reporter at the Nashville paper who had been covering environmental issues in the state for years. Douglas Hargrove's attorneys issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and politically motivated. They did not explain what politics had to do with a retired high school teacher and a dead engineer's boxes. I am not going to stand here and tell you that everything resolved cleanly and quickly. It didn't. These things don't. There will be years of legal proceedings. The settlement unsealing is still being contested. The regulatory process moves slowly. I have spent more time on the phone with attorneys in the past 4 months than I spent in the previous 6 decades combined. But here is what I can tell you has happened. Millbrook Crossing has been designated as a site requiring environmental assessment by the state. The families there, the ones who are still there, finally have answers to questions. Some of them have been carrying since 2003. 2 families whose children had unexplained health issues now have documentation that their doctors asked to review. I cannot say what that means medically. I am not a doctor, but I believe they deserve to know. And Douglas Hargrove, for the first time in 50 years, is having to answer questions he thought had been sealed away permanently. I don't know what my father felt for the last 20 years. I don't know if keeping those documents was his way of trying to hold on to some form of integrity, or if he always intended to do something with them and just never found the courage. I don't know if the watch was guilt, money, or genuine gratitude, or both. He was a complicated man, and he is gone, and I will not be able to ask him. What I know is that he did not destroy the evidence. He kept it. dated it, wrote the truth in the margins, and sealed it in an envelope with instructions for what to do when he was no longer here to be afraid. I think that matters. I think that is the thing I am holding on to. My sister and I agreed that we would not donate the watch, and we would not keep it. We gave it to Ms. Pryor as part of the documentary record, physical evidence of the relationship between my father and Douglas Hargrove. She said it might be useful. I was glad to have it out of my nightstand. You still have his Timex. The brown leather band. The simple face. That one I kept. That one sits on my nightstand now. And some mornings when I'm getting dressed, I look at it and I think about all the things a quiet man carries through a life without ever letting them show on his face. My father taught me more than I realized, just not in the ways either of us would have chosen. I am 64 years old. I am a retired history teacher. I grow tomatoes in the summer, and I drink too much coffee, and I go to bed before 10 most nights. But I am also my father's son, and he left me something that needed to be finished. So I finished it. If you are out there carrying something that belongs to the light, something someone else handed you in the dark and asked you to keep quiet, I want you to know that it is not too late. It is not too late to open the envelope. It is not too late to walk into the right person's office and set it on their desk. The truth does not expire. It just waits for someone with enough courage to carry it the last mile. My father got most of the way there. I'm glad I was here to take it the rest.